Among the muffled echoes of the hills of Jerusalem, Golgotha stood as an altar of pain and judgment. The air carried an invisible, almost sacred tension. Men, women, and soldiers huddled around the central cross, where Jesus, crowned with thorns and covered in wounds, remained suspended between earth and heaven. The crowd watched in tense silence or open mockery as time seemed to stretch like the crucified's own agony. But amidst that brutal scene, something almost imperceptible was happening. The eyes of a man hardened by war, a Roman centurion, began to grasp a truth that went beyond the blood and screams. He did not yet understand, but he felt. With every word from Jesus, with every silence stronger than any plea, the soldier was drawn into a conflict that was not military, but spiritual. The mission that day was simple: execute the sentence. But as time passed, what seemed like a ritual of public punishment became a silent enigma that weighed on his soul. The crucifixion of Jesus did not follow the usual pattern. There were no screams of hatred or pleas for mercy. Instead, there was forgiveness and a strange kind of royalty. The tunic that covered Jesus before being removed was made of a single piece of fabric, without seams, something rare and valuable. The soldiers, as usual, divided the garments of the condemned. But this tunic in particular was different. They did not tear it. They cast lots for it. And there, in that simple gesture, something profound was sown. It was just a piece of clothing, many would say. But in the quietness of that centurion's heart, something else was revealing itself. A symbol, a sign, a silence that screamed. Why didn't they divide it as usual? Why preserve this piece specifically? In Jewish tradition, clothing represented not just the physical, but also the spiritual. Tearing a garment was an act of mourning, of despair. And yet, there, at the darkest moment, Jesus' tunic remained intact. It wasn't for aesthetics or superstition. It was as if something, or someone, was saying, "You do not tear what is won." And that centurion, accustomed to dividing territories and ordering destructions, felt for the first time the presence of something indivisible. The words of Jesus, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do," caused a visceral discomfort in the centurion. He had seen hundreds die, some in anger, others in fear, but never with compassion. That speech was not weakness. It was pure strength, something that defied the laws of war and the code of men. He looked at the crucified man and, for a moment, the universe seemed to fall silent. The sun was hiding, the shadows were lengthening, and then came the earthquake. The ground shook, the sky darkened, and the veil of the temple tore from top to bottom. The Pharisees, the priests, the crowd, all stepped back. But the centurion stayed, eyes fixed on the man on the cross, hard at war with his own reason. And then, instinctively, he shouted, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." It was more than a phrase. It was a confession, a surrender, a birth. This cry, however, was not heard attentively. It passed as part of the tumult, but within it was enclosed the beginning of a spiritual journey that still echoes. The tunic was not torn, but the heart of that soldier, yes. And from the cracks of this broken heart, a new kind of courage sprouted, not the one that dominates, but the one that understands, not the one that conquers, but the one that surrenders to the truth. His gaze met that of Jesus' mother. She said nothing, but in that silent exchange, he saw pain and faith in their purest form. Here was a woman who had lost a son but not hope. The soldier, trained to destroy, felt small in her presence, and something within him shifted, as if a stone was removed from his chest, revealing a flame he didn't know he carried. At the end of that day, as he gathered the remains of what seemed to be just another execution, the centurion held in his hands the tunic that was not divided. And unknowingly, he also carried the seed of an invisible fraternity, a brotherhood born from the silence of a crucified God and the spiritual revelation of a man accustomed to war. A fraternity without a name yet, but that would carry in the future a simple and profound title: the Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic. Because it wasn't about the cloth. It was about what it represented: the unbreakable unity, the spirit that does not divide, and more deeply the promise that even the toughest of men can be touched by the sacred. When the earth trembled beneath his feet and the sky was cloaked in darkness, the Roman centurion felt more than fear. He felt the collapse of an inner world he had until then considered solid. The roar of the earth seemed to echo within his chest, as if the universe were screaming inside him. The death of Jesus was not just the end of a life, but the beginning of a profound and irreversible change. The eyes that had witnessed so many battles and executions now could no longer face the world in the same way. Something had been broken, and at the same time, something new was rising from the ruins of his former identity. As the crowd fled, scared by the signs in the sky, the centurion remained still. His eyes scanned the lifeless body of Jesus, now enveloped by an almost inconceivable peace. He expected to see the final horror, the collapse of a defeated man. But what he saw was different, the expression of a sacred rest, as if the one who had just died was more alive than everyone around him. This contradiction would haunt him in the following days like an invisible perfume, like a presence that could not be explained. That night, sleep did not come. His head leaned against the armor, his eyes fixed on the stars, and in his chest, chaos. For the first time in years he dreamt, but it was not a common dream. It was a vivid scene. He was walking through a golden field, hearing distant voices singing in a language he did not know, but understood. In the center of the field, the cross. But there was no blood, no suffering, only light. He woke up sweating, his heart racing, and even though he couldn't explain, he knew that something sacred had touched his soul. The following days were filled with a heavy silence. He was still a centurion. He still had to follow orders, lead men, represent the empire. But inside, everything was changing. He began to notice the details that previously went unnoticed: the gaze of a beggar, the pain of a child, the patience of a woman by the well. Everything seemed loaded with meaning, as if the world, previously mechanical and predictable, now breathed spirituality on all sides. The strong and cold soldier was starting to become a vulnerable and curious man. He sought in secret information about the man they crucified. He asked merchants, slaves, fishermen. He heard stories that seemed fanciful, but which touched his heart like no military doctrine ever did. Miracles, forgiveness, love for enemies, healing with hands, multiplication of bread. Stories of a kingdom that was not of this world, but lived within each one. And the more he heard, the more his restlessness grew. How could he have been blind to all of this? One afternoon, passing near the temple, he heard murmurs about the veil that had torn from top to bottom at the exact moment of Jesus' death. This veil separated the most sacred place from the rest of the temple, reserved only for the high priest. What did this tear mean? For him, the answer was clear. What was inaccessible was now open. The divine had breached the wall. The sacred had broken the barrier. And this made sense with everything he was beginning to feel. He, a foreigner, a soldier, an oppressor, was being called into something much bigger than any imperial conquest. It was in this state of inner fervor that he sought out one of Jesus' followers. He found a young man who claimed to have heard the Master speak. The conversation was brief, but impactful. The young man did not try to convince him. He simply said, "If you have seen and felt, then you already know." This sentence became an echo within his soul. The centurion then understood that he did not need proof, but surrender. What he was seeking was not in books or doctrines. It was in the experience that had already touched him. It was as if Jesus had left an impression on his soul that no word could explain. The tension was growing inside him. He was trained to obey, to act, But now all he wanted was to contemplate, understand, feel. His life was divided between the violent exterior and the peaceful interior. He began to avoid practices he used to do without thinking. He started treating his subordinates with more dignity. His posture changed. His eyes, once hard, now carried compassion. Some noticed, others mocked. But no one understood what was happening inside him, not even he. It was as if a new man was being born, and the old one was slowly dying, crucified in silence. Restlessness turned into a quest, and the quest into prayer. A prayer without words, made of sighs, of held-back tears, of long walks at dusk. He didn't know how to pray like the Jews. He didn't know any psalms, but his heart spoke, and something, or someone, listened. He felt a constant presence, sometimes like a warmth in his chest, other times like a gentle breeze. He began to call this presence the one who speaks in silence. It was Jesus, but it was also something more. It was the Spirit that guided him. The reports began to arrive. They said that Jesus had risen, that the tomb was empty, that he had appeared to many. The centurion did not see, but he believed, not as one who accepts a story, but as one who recognizes a truth that already dwells within him. The resurrection for him was already happening, in his soul. The man who had been an instrument of death was now walking towards life. He began to gather other soldiers who had also been touched. Some had been at Golgotha, others had heard reports. They formed a small, hidden, silent group. There was no name, no doctrine. There was only a common feeling. Something had changed, and they could not go back. A fraternity was beginning to emerge, almost invisibly. A bond between men of war who were now seeking inner peace. A silent current connecting awakened hearts. And without even realizing it, they were becoming the first members of something profound. A brotherhood, born from the invisible impact of Christ. And so, the centurion who witnessed the death became a seed of life. The man of the spear became a pilgrim of the Spirit. He did not know what the future held, but he knew that the wind had changed. The same breath that passed through Jesus in that last sigh now blew in his soul, pushing him towards a destiny he could not yet see, but already felt with every step. Silence was his new language. After the events at Golgotha, the centurion increasingly distanced himself from the noises of military life. Marches, orders, shouts, everything that once constituted his world now seemed to him an empty theater. His soul, marked by something he couldn't explain in words, yearned for answers. Not rational answers, but spiritual ones. The wound that Jesus had left in his heart didn't bleed, but it burned, and this burning drove him. He then began to discreetly wander through Jerusalem, asking, observing, listening, searching. One of the first encounters was unexpected. In a discreet alley near the fisherman's district, he found an elderly woman selling fabrics. Drawn to a tunic similar to what Jesus wore, he struck up a conversation. Upon mentioning him, the woman's eyes filled with tears. She was a follower of the Nazarene. Her son had been healed of paralysis by him. "He didn't touch my son," she said. "He just looked." Those words penetrated deep into his chest. A look that heals, a silence that liberates. How to explain this within a mind trained to command with force? A few days later, he heard rumors about a disciple who had stayed at the foot of the cross. A young man named John. After persisting with acquaintances and using his position to open doors, he managed to find him discreetly. The conversation was brief, but unforgettable. John didn't speak of miracles, nor of dogmas. He spoke of love. A love that does not judge, does not demand, but transforms. He said that Jesus loved him like a brother, even knowing his flaws. He didn't want followers who feared him, but those who remembered him, John asserted. His memory is a living presence. The centurion left that meeting in silence, but carrying something new. a direction. He then began to seek out each witness, each disciple, each story. Some spoke of the multiplication of loaves, others of the healing of lepers, and still others of the resurrection of Lazarus. But there was something common in all of them. None spoke as if boasting of an extraordinary feat. They all spoke as those deeply touched by a kindness not found in this world. It was more than power. It was presence. The centurion was beginning to understand that Jesus had not just performed miracles, he was the miracle. The revelation came in layers. First, he understood that Jesus was not just a simple rebel, as many soldiers thought. Then he saw that he was not just a prophet. And then he began to feel, deep within, that Jesus was the very expression of the divine incarnate. But what disconcerted him most was realizing that this divine did not come with force, but with tenderness. It did not impose, it offered itself. It was a crucified God, not a conquering God. A love that bleeds, but does not hurt. That dies, but does not kill. These findings led him to an even greater internal conflict. If Jesus was who he seemed to be, then what did that say about him? A soldier, part of the machinery that condemned him. Guilt, shame, but also hope. He saw the look of forgiveness on the cross. He heard the Father forgive them. And now, for the first time in his life, he understood that forgiveness was a liberation, not a punishment. He could change. He was changing. And then, one night after hearing a story about the resurrection, a meeting between Mary Magdalene and the Master in the garden, something inside him broke. That story of the woman who, crying, encountered a man she didn't immediately recognize, but who called her by name. It touched him in an indescribable way. "Mary," Jesus said. And in that moment, she knew. The centurion wept in silence. He knew what it was like to be called from the inside out. That was his story too. There was no logic, but there was truth. He began to realize that his transformation was not unique. Other soldiers spoke less, but carried the same look, a mix of awe and tenderness. He began to notice subtleties, an exchange of glances between armored brothers, a silent gesture of respect in front of a child, a hidden prayer at sunrise. The echoes of Golgotha spread everywhere. That death had left a trail of life wherever it went. And it was then that he heard about a small group that met in secret. They were not Pharisees nor zealots. They were simple men and women who shared bread, prayers, and silence. There, he found what he was seeking: presence. No one commanded, no one disputed. They simply lived as if Jesus was still among them, and in some way, he was. He recognized it in the breaking of the bread, in the compassionate gaze, in the silence filled with meaning. It was there that his spirit found rest. In the following weeks, he immersed himself in this new way of living. He maintained the appearance of a centurion, but inside he was another man. He lived in two worlds, that of imperial discipline and that of the spirit. But something in him knew that soon he would have to choose. Still, in that time of search, he found an unfamiliar peace. He no longer needed to understand everything. It was enough to follow that inner breath that guided him. A breath that led him to truth, not as a dogma, but as a living experience. It reminded him of the body stretched out on the cross, but also of the unripped tunic, of the word forgiveness, but also of the gesture of acceptance, of death and rebirth. It was the echo of a silence that spoke louder than any imperial trumpet. And in this echo, he began to hear his own soul. In that era, when names held power and symbols, destiny, there was something sacred being conceived in the depths of the Roman soul. The centurion, previously solitary in his quest, began to recognize a pattern. He was not alone. Men and women, many of whom had never spoken to each other, carried the same restrained flame in their gaze. They were soldiers, widows, young servants, old slaves. all pierced by a mystery that could not be explained with words. It was as if an invisible network connected them, stitched together by the same spiritual thread that could not be seen, only felt. The meeting point was not a temple, nor a synagogue, but the heart. A subtle, almost imperceptible recognition among those who had been touched by Jesus or his legacy. And at the center of this common awakening was the symbol of the robe. The same robe that was not torn, the one that the soldiers gambled for. For the Centurion, this was not just a keepsake, it was a sign, a reminder that unity could not be destroyed, that the Spirit dressed in wholeness, not in fragments. And it was in this sentiment that the idea of a silent fraternity began to emerge. Meetings began to take place, initially with 2 or 3 people, then with more. Always in secret, always in discreet locations, an abandoned ruin, a craftsman's backyard, the edge of a brook. There they shared experiences, dreams, visions, and questions. There was no hierarchy, there was no dogma. There was an unwritten code, based on compassion, listening, and truth. Each new member was recognized not by a ritual, but by their inner transformation. It was as if the Spirit of Jesus, invisible but present, attracted them like silent magnets. The name emerged spontaneously, the Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic, a paradox at first glance. But for them, it was full of meaning. Because even if the physical tunic had not been divided, their lives had been torn, exposed, opened to the light. And in that tear, a new garment was being woven, that of the Spirit, an invisible tunic that covered them with meaning, with courage, with faith. The name was a reminder that the integrity of Christ withstood fragmentation, and therefore, they too would endure. Over time, they began to develop small rituals, nothing extravagant. A piece of bread shared in silence, a candle lit before prayer, a stone symbolizing the burden they left behind. Each gesture carried intention, not to impress, but to remember, to keep alive the presence of the one who had taught with gestures, silences, and glances. The robe was remembered, not as a relic, but as an essence, a way of living. The Centurion unintentionally became a guide among them, not by knowledge, but by experience. It was he who had been there, seen, felt. His story touched the new members, but he always made it clear, it was not I who found him, it was he who reached me. This humility sealed his leadership with spiritual authority, not imposed, but recognized. His accounts about the day of the crucifixion circulated like living poetry. They were passed from mouth to mouth, filled with silence between the sentences, as if each pause carried a revelation. The fraternity was growing in depth, not in number. Many were afraid to get involved, others didn't understand the calling. But those who came, stayed. And they transformed. Some began to abandon violence. Others started to heal the sick with their hands. Some simply changed their way of looking at the world. It was a silent revolution, invisible to the eyes of the empire, but powerful enough to move mountains within each one. They avoided any ostentation. They knew they were vulnerable. The empire still saw the followers of Jesus as a threat to order. The Pharisees viewed them as heresy, and many Jews treated them with contempt. For this reason, they sought protection in anonymity. The symbol of the tunic began to be secretly drawn on clay pieces, small marks left on doors, stones, or fabrics. Never direct, always veiled, like a nod to the spirit of those who knew how to see. Even among soldiers, the movement was gaining strength. Some were deserting, others remained in strategic positions, living a double life. But everyone knew, loyalty had shifted. Now they belonged to something greater than Caesar. They served a king who ruled the invisible, who didn't impose, but touched, who didn't threaten, but transformed. There were reports of healings, of shared dreams, of synchronicities impossible to explain. Once, a woman touched by fraternity claimed to have seen Jesus in a vision, wearing a robe that shone like fire, but without burning. She said that he looked at her and smiled. Then, he disappeared. This account circulated throughout the community as confirmation that he was present among them, not in body, but in spirit. The robe was alive. Over time, they began to create texts, prayers, chants, concealed, coded, transmitted with extreme care. These records were kept by chosen members, always ready to destroy them if necessary. But at its core, what mattered was what was alive in the heart. No written word could replace the flame that burned in the soul. And so, like seeds planted in the darkness of the earth, fraternity was growing, without making noise, without seeking fame, but touching every corner of the empire, through men and women who no longer accepted living on the surface. They wanted depth. They wanted presence. They wanted to wear, each within themselves, the robe that was not torn. The Centurion, now older, looked at this movement with reverence. He knew that the mission was still in its early stages, but he also knew that something eternal had already begun. An invisible brotherhood, but real, that didn't require temples, only awakened hearts. The Roman Empire, in its arrogance and power, did not notice when the real challenge to its order began to spread. It did not come with swords nor shields. It did not march in rows, nor did it dominate territories. But it silently infiltrated the cities, the fields, the barracks, and the souls. The Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic, still without temples or priests, grew like an underground river, fed by an invisible source, impossible to stop. The members did not publicly proclaim their faith. They lived as if something eternal was already happening within them. The Centurion, now a mature man but intensely alert, began to secretly correspond with other brothers in different regions of the empire. Alexandria, Antioch, Ephesus, Rome. These were not evangelical missions, like those that the apostles would later carry out, but small personal movements. Soldiers, merchants, weavers, and even nobles who had been touched by the living message of Christ. Through hidden symbols, veiled phrases, and discreet gestures, they recognized each other. When two brothers from the fraternity met, there was no need for proof. The spirit that united them was enough. The expansion began in the barracks. Soldiers who had been silently transformed were passing on the message, not as preachers, but as witnesses. They did not speak of dogmas, but of presence, of a new way of being in the world. These men, once hardened by war, now carried tenderness and discipline in harmony. They held their posts, but no longer killed with the same coldness. Many preferred to disobey cruel orders rather than violate the integrity of the spirit now dwelling within them. They became guardians of the invisible, defenders of a truth that did not require imposition. Over time, secret manuscripts emerged. Short letters, parables, accounts of visions and songs, encoded writings, often camouflaged among administrative texts or herb recipes. A keen eye and an awakened heart knew where to find the message. These manuscripts circulated from hand to hand, passing through trade routes, hidden in wine jars, leather pouches, or within double scrolls. Each word was a spiritual breath, a spark ignited in prepared souls. The presence of the fraternity made itself felt in Alexandria, where brilliant minds sought to reconcile faith and philosophy. There, the idea of the single tunic took on even deeper symbolic contours. Christian philosophers saw in it the unity of the cosmos, the spiritual garment of the cosmic Christ that covers all creation. In Antioch, it became a symbol of integrity, of an indivisible heart, aligned with the divine will. Each city brought a different color to the fraternity, but the core remained the same: fidelity to the truth lived by Jesus and perpetuated in the silence of the Spirit. The members of the Brotherhood maintained a code of conduct. It wasn't a rigid set of rules, but an inner ethic. Not to kill without necessity. Seek truth before speaking. Serve before dominating. Live simply. Care for the sick, comfort the afflicted, share what one has. Many of these principles later became the seeds of what would be Christian virtues: But here they were still free from institutionalization. They were pure experiences, embodied in everyday gestures. At the same time, difficulties arose. The empire did not look kindly upon these men who, although seemingly loyal, carried something that defied the logic of power. They were soldiers who refused to kill indiscriminately, slaves who spoke of inner freedom, merchants who forfeited profits to help the needy. It was not violent subversion, but it was dangerous, because it was real, because it changed the human being from within. And no empire can withstand a transformed humanity. Some members were arrested, others disappeared, but even amidst these adversities the fraternity grew, because it was invisible, because it was internal, and because it was based not on external promises, but on profound personal experiences. Many who did not know the cross of Christ, but only its fruits, also joined the cause. They saw in the fraternity members something different, a steady peace, a silent compassion, a sparkle in their eyes. And they wanted that too. The tunic has become a more prevalent symbol, not the physical tunic, whose actual fate was never known, but the concept. They began to weave small strips of cloth with continuous stitching, which some members carried with them as a memento. Others discreetly drew the tunic on walls, behind tapestries, or on stones left in special places. It was a shared symbolic language, a silent reminder. We are one in spirit. At that time, the Centurion had already begun to live between two worlds in an almost irreconcilable way. His body still served Rome, but his soul belonged to something eternal. He knew he couldn't maintain this duplicity forever. But he also understood that his presence within that system allowed him to protect brothers, facilitate meetings, and spread the flame. He became a link, a channel, and more than that, a guardian, not of a doctrine, but of a mystery. Reports of healings began to circulate, not theatrical miracles, but healings of the heart. A young soldier freeing himself from chronic anger, a woman wounded by the pain of loss finding meaning again, an elderly man who had lost faith starting to smile again. The Brotherhood did not promise miracles, but wherever it went, lives flourished. It wasn't magic, it was presence. It was the invisible touch of Christ, transcending centuries and structures. On the outskirts of the empire, in small villages and forgotten ports, brothers began to emerge who had never seen Jerusalem, but recognized the truth of Christ as if hearing a song they had always known. It was as if the message was inscribed in their souls, simply waiting for a touch to awaken. And the Brotherhood, with its simplicity and depth, offered exactly that. Thus, with gentle steps, awakened hearts, and willing souls, the Brotherhood of the Torn Robe expanded, invisible, indestructible, and alive. Not for the words it preached, but for the love it embodied. In the chaotic scene of the Crucifixion, where everything seemed to crumble, there was a silent gesture that many ignored. Jesus' tunic was not torn. Amid the violence, the mockery, and the fragmentation, the Roman soldiers decided to cast lots for it, perhaps out of superstition, perhaps for its material value. But in the hidden web of symbols, this small detail holds a profound key. The integrity of the tunic spoke of the integrity of the soul, something that the world could not divide. This tunic, made from a single piece of fabric, without seams, was rare. Its construction required continuous work, without joints. On a spiritual level, it represented more than a garment. It was the reflection of the complete being, of the unfragmented human. A robe of wholeness, symbol of Christ himself as the archetype of the union between the divine and the earthly. And in a world marked by divisions, among people between rich and poor, between faith and reason, it emerged as a living reminder of the unity we had all lost. For the first brothers of the Fraternity of the Torn Tunic, this symbol became central. They did not see it as a relic, but as a message. They did not seek to find the physical object. They knew its essence was beyond the material. The tunic was the human soul before it was torn by guilt, by violence, by pride. It was the garment of innocence, and by remaining whole, even in the hands of those who crucified Christ, it revealed a powerful teaching. There is something in us that the world cannot destroy. The Jewish mystical and Essene traditions already spoke of the garment of the soul, a kind of spiritual body that envelops the inner being. This idea was revisited among the brothers of the fraternity. They understood that the robe was also the visible manifestation of what is invisible, the pure, intact spiritual field that remains within each one, even after the fall. This field, this inner fabric, is what connects us to the divine. Preserving it is the true path to liberation. With this understanding, the fraternity began to develop inner practices that aimed to stitch this inner tunic back together, not through external rituals, but through personal transformation, silence, contemplation, charity, humility. Each act aligned with Christ was like a point of spiritual thread, restoring the invisible garment of the being. And the tunic in its entirety became the constant reference. How are we living? Are we preserving or tearing our inner self? Some texts from the older members of the fraternity compared the robe to the body of light, mentioned in other ancient traditions. The Gnostics, for example, spoke of the perfect man as one who wears the mantle of gnosis, the living knowledge of truth. Others, like the Desert Fathers, described visions in which Christ appeared enveloped in a light that covered like a robe. For all of them, the symbol remained. There is a spiritual garment that must be preserved, and it can only be sewn from within. This unity represented by the tunic directly confronted the structures of the world. The empire thrived on fragmentation, between provinces, between classes, between gods. The institutionalized religion thrived on the separation between pure and impure, between priest and people. But the tunic spoke of a reverse path, the essential unity of all, a garment that makes no distinction, that covers with equality, that respects the dignity of each soul. This idea in itself was deeply revolutionary. And that's why, over time, the symbol of the robe began to cause discomfort. Because wherever it appeared, a new perspective on others also emerged. The slave ceased to be an object, the woman, a property, the enemy, a reflection. The robe united what the world had separated, and this union could not be governed, taxed, or manipulated. Therefore, it was dangerous, and for that reason, it was sacred. The Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic, although made up of discrete members, began to nurture an increasingly heightened awareness about the role of this symbol. They came to understand that the tunic was not torn because it carried the undivided image of Christ. To tear it would be an affront to the greater plan, the plan of reconciliation between all that had been lost. Preserving it was to preserve the promise of a new man, of a new humanity. And this promise resonated deeply, because everyone knew deep down what it felt like to be fragmented. Everyone carried scars, guilt, painful memories. The tunic showed that it was possible to put oneself back together, that no matter how much life had torn your dreams, your faith, or your dignity, there was a deeper garment that could still be restored. This garment was the living Christ within each being. In some fraternity meditations, a silent metaphor was used, the invisible stitch. Each act of love, each forgiveness, each gesture of compassion was a spiritual needle that sewed the inner robe. No one saw the result, but the spirit felt it, and gradually the soul began to breathe fully again. It was a process, a path, a call to lost unity that only Christ could restore, from the inside out. The tunic also became a reminder against spiritual pride, because it was not human merit that kept it intact, but the very strength of the Spirit. The garment was not earned, it was received, but its preservation depended on daily choices, on attention, on humility, on a heart that recognizes itself as a temple of the eternal. Therefore, the brothers did not speak of the tunic with vanity. They spoke with reverence, with gratitude. And so, this symbol became the quiet center of an inner revolution. The Brotherhood of the Torn Robe did not preach a doctrine. It invited one to clothe oneself again with what the world tries to take away: spiritual dignity, sacred unity, the light that envelops the soul. The robe was not torn, because what it represents can never be divided. The sun was still rising red over the marble columns of Rome, reflecting its splendor and shadow. The empire stretched like an iron net over the known world, its legions, its laws, its language. It was total order, but that very order began to creak in the corners of the unseen. A silent, impalpable force was growing within the very walls. It did not come from rebel armies or political factions, but from men and women who had traded dominion for service, power for presence. The Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic had reached the heart of the empire, and at the same time, it was beyond it. The Centurion, now older, quieter, and more awake, had left the East and was in Rome. Not on a mission, but driven by an inner guidance. His path led him there as if an invisible hand was tracing his journey. He realized that Rome was not just a city, it was a symbol. It represented the old world, the system that rules, that divides, that conquers. And it was there, precisely there, that the seed of brotherhood needed to be planted most firmly. Because if Rome symbolized the external empire, the brotherhood represented the inner kingdom, and the two were about to meet. In the capital, he found other brothers, disguised, hidden among the crowd. Some soldiers still in service, others freedmen who worked as servants, cooks, copyists. There was even a Roman senator who, in secret, had been touched by fraternity. In discreet meetings, they exchanged symbols, whispered prayers, broken bread. But more than that, they exchanged presence. It was as if each meeting renewed the inner tunic, sewing with invisible threads the soul of a collective body. The tension between the two worlds was palpable. In public, they were Romans. In private, citizens of another kingdom. The Centurion knew he couldn't live long in this duplicity, and this awareness didn't come from fear, it came from truth. The kingdom of Christ couldn't be lived in parts. It demanded the whole, an undivided heart, like the tunic. And Rome, with its power games, demanded absolute loyalty. The collision was inevitable. Rumors began to emerge of a spiritual movement that preached love for the enemy, eternal life, humility. A group that gathered without temples, that refused to worship the gods of the state, that did not bow down to the emperor as a deity. The guardians of the empire felt something was slipping away. And as it always happens, what is not understood is seen as a threat. Timid persecutions began. One brother was captured and did not return. Another disappeared. The fraternity did not resist with weapons. They resisted with faith, with silence, with firmness. The Centurion began to write letters, not as doctrine but as testimony. He wrote to distant brothers. He spoke of the tunic, of Christ, of the inner light that no prison could extinguish. His words were simple but fervent. He knew he might not survive for long, but he also knew that his legacy was already sown, not in monuments, but in souls. Each letter that was smuggled out by a mule, within a clay pot, was a spark that set hearts ablaze. One night he had a vision. He dreamed about the city in flames, but from the ashes columns of light rose. Simple men in white robes walked among the rubble, smiling. In the center was he, the Christ, not glorified in gold but dressed simply in the seamless robe. He looked at him and said, "My kingdom is within, and nobody can take it." Upon waking, the Centurion understood. The real Rome that needed to fall was the one that lived within him. The pride, the fear, the false identity. The old man, only then could the new one be born. The Brotherhood then began to focus their efforts not on converting, but on awakening. Each member saw themselves as a living temple. Presence was the testimony. Attitudes were the letter. They didn't preach, but embodied. And this was more powerful than any speech, because those who live the truth in silence shake more than those who proclaim it loudly without coherence. And in every compassionate face, every gesture of kindness, Rome was confronted, not with violence, but with light. Reports of mystical experiences began to multiply. Some brothers reported hearing voices during prayer, others, dreams in which they were instructed. A soldier recounted that, when assaulted by a superior for refusing to kill, he felt a heat coursing through his body, as if he was being protected from within. These manifestations were not broadcasted, they were held with reverence. They knew they were not meant to prove anything, but to strengthen the spirit on the journey. In a short time, the fraternity became an invisible field connecting awakened souls throughout Rome, a living flow of real spirituality. Some future historians tried to trace its structure, its doctrines, its founders, but they found nothing, because it was not an organization, it was a vibration, a field of consciousness. The kingdom that Jesus had said was, "in the midst of you," now recognized by those who had been touched. The choice between Rome and the kingdom became inevitable for the Centurion. He knew he would be marked, and he accepted. When he was questioned about his connections with followers of the Nazarene, he did not deny. He did not raise his voice. He did not try to escape. He simply said, "I served the empire of men with my body. Now I serve the kingdom of God with my soul." There was no trial, just disappearance. His name did not enter the annals of Rome, but it was recorded in another book, invisible, eternal. His disappearance did not weaken the Brotherhood. On the contrary, it strengthened it, because true strength is not in physical permanence, but in fidelity to the Spirit. He became an invisible martyr, an example, an inner reference point for those who still lived between the two worlds. His life said, "It is possible to be in Rome and still belong to the kingdom, but at some point, a choice will have to be made." And so, the Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic established itself as a bridge between times, between dimensions, between worlds. From Rome, the empire of men, to the inner kingdom, where true freedom pulses, silent, serene, sacred. Much has been said over the centuries about the resurrection of Jesus as a historical fact. The stone rolled away, the empty tomb, the appearances. But for the members of the fraternity of the Torn Tunic, the greatest miracle was not the return of the body, it was the awakening of the soul. They knew that the real resurrection was an internal phenomenon, a breaking of the veil of ignorance, an emergence of the divine that silently dwells within every human being. For them, Christ not only rose again, he taught how everyone could rise again, alive. This vision changed everything. Faith ceased to be blind belief in a past event and became a present, alive, profound practice. The Centurion, whose soul had already died to old Rome, had experienced this resurrection. He did not return from physical death, but he was born again. His old identity, shaped by duty, violence, and human glory, was left behind, and in its place, a new man emerged. A being with eyes for the invisible, with ears for the silence, with a heart for love. This transformation was the true sign of the risen Christ. For the Brotherhood, to resurrect was to renounce the world that imprisons. Not the physical world, but the world of illusion, of pride, of separation. It was to allow the old I to be crucified, so that the true I am could emerge. And this wasn't done just with beautiful words or theological convictions. It was done in the flesh, day by day, in the struggles with one's own ego. It was in the act of forgiving the enemy, serving the ungrateful, listening to the silence, that one began to resurrect. The tunic in this context was the garment of the new consciousness, one that is not given by status, religion, or birth, but by inner transformation. The brothers of the fraternity believed that the Spirit of Christ dressed the renewed soul as a garment of light, not a visible tunic, but a vibrational field of pure love. And anyone who truly surrendered to this process of death and rebirth, even if they did not proclaim it with words, began to shine, discreetly but intensely. They were recognized by the silence they carried, by the peace they exuded. In the practices of the Brotherhood, silent meditations emerged where this inner resurrection was visualized. Some brothers would retreat for 3 days, fasting and in tranquility, symbolizing the time of Jesus in the tomb. On the 3rd day they would rise at sunrise, walk in silence to a hill, and, looking at the horizon, they would make a single prayer: "Awaken in me, O living Christ." This simple but profound gesture marked the lives of many. There was no mystical vision, no ecstasy, but there was real transformation, a deep peace, an internal decision to live from the Spirit, not the ego. The writings that circulated among the brothers spoke little of the literal resurrection, but much of the resurrection of the heart. In one of these letters, a brother wrote, "His death freed me, but his resurrection taught me to live." In another secret manuscript, it was said that, when the robe of the ego is torn, the robe of the Spirit will be revealed in its indivisible light. These teachings were not aimed to impress, they healed, because they spoke of the deepest human experience, overcoming oneself to emerge as an instrument of the divine. There were also reports of siblings who, after years of inner practice, entered states of such profound presence that they claimed to feel Christ living within them. It wasn't a hallucination, it was fusion. It wasn't imitation, it was unity. As if the spark that had always been there, in the deepest part of the being, finally ignited into living fire. And in that fire there was no longer the old name, the past, the fear. There was only love, only life, only Him. This inner resurrection was not permanent. It required vigilance, consistency, humility. It was easy to slip back into the old pattern. That's why the brothers would gather, to remind each other, to watch over in community, to remind themselves that the robe needed to be protected and the soul nourished. They knew that it wasn't enough to die just once. It was necessary to die every day, to die to pride, to resentment, to vanity, so that the new life could always emerge, fresh, true, luminous. Over time, expressions such as "to wear Christ" or "to clothe oneself in light" began to emerge. These images spoke of the same reality. The body was still walking in the world, but the spirit was already living in another time, in another dimension. It was like living between worlds, with feet on the ground but the heart in heaven. As one of the most repeated phrases among them said, "It is not I who live, it is Christ who lives in me." This resurrected living did not prevent pain, but it gave it meaning. It did not avoid loss, but it brought comfort. It did not nullify the challenges of human life, but it offered an inner strength to face them with dignity, serenity, and faith. Because the resurrected one is not the invulnerable. It's the one who no longer fears death, because they know that true life begins from within. And so, the true legacy of the crucified and resurrected Christ was passed on not as doctrine, but as experience. From soul to soul, from silence to silence. And even when history tried to erase the traces of the Brotherhood, even when empires rose and fell, this inner fire would continue to burn. Because the robe of the soul, once restored, can never be torn again. The resurrection was not just his, it was everyone's. It was a call for now. In every generation, there are those who hear something that others ignore. A silent sound, an inner memory, a restlessness that won't be silenced. They are not smarter, more virtuous, or chosen. They are simply those who, for some sacred reason, decided to look within. They were touched by something that transcends time and books. And in that touch, they began an invisible journey, that of restoring their inner robe. The Brotherhood of the Torn Robe, therefore, was never an organization. It has always been a condition of the soul. The Centurion, that man who carried iron in his fist and stones in his soul, became the first of many. He did not found a religion. He did not write gospels. He did not seek followers. But he lived what he saw, and that was enough to trigger a movement that time did not erase. Because what is born of truth, even if buried in silence, blooms in eternity. This fraternity is composed of all those who, when faced with suffering, do not harden, of all those who, in the face of injustice, do not surrender to anger, of all those who, touched by a higher truth, accept to die to the old self and be born into a new life. They live among us, and perhaps, brother, you are one of them. The tunic that was not torn remains as an eternal reminder that there is something within us that is indivisible, that cannot be fragmented by pains, nor by history. It is the spark of the divine that dwells in every human being, and that once accessed, transforms everything. The world may take everything from us, but it cannot tear what is one with the Spirit. How many times have you felt that there is something in your soul that the world tries to erase but insists on staying? How many times has the silence spoken louder than words? How many times have you cried, not out of pain, but from recognizing, even if for a second, that there is something sacred within you? This is the robe. This is the brotherhood. This call does not require dogma, nor titles, nor merits. It only requires one thing, a willingness to remember who you are. Amid the chaos, the noise, the promises of the outside world, the brotherhood invites you to return, to clothe yourself in light, to reclaim the wholeness of the soul, to walk in the world without losing yourself in it. And how to live this today? The answer is not in joining a hidden group or following an ancient ritual. The answer lies in the way you look at others, how you treat your silence, how you behave when no one is watching. The robe is woven in the everyday. Brotherhood is lived in the invisible. And your presence in this world is perhaps the presence of Christ in human form, not to dominate, but to heal. The tunic in this sense is also a mirror. It reveals where we are still divided, where we tear ourselves apart from the inside, where there is a lack of compassion, humility, truth, and it gently invites us to sew these parts back together with patience, to reconnect, to reunite, to reverse the motion of the fall, not in a rush, but with firmness. Every act of forgiveness, every choice for peace, every sincere tear, every gesture of unconditional love, all of this is a stitch in this spiritual seam. You may never see the robe you are weaving, but the world will feel it, and this silent presence will transform the environment wherever you are. Because whoever wears Christ, even without words, is light where everything is shadow. Today's world is no less confusing than Rome once was. The empire is now internal, made up of anxiety, ego, greed, haste. But the path remains the same. The kingdom is within you. And Christ is not dead, nor absent. He manifests in those who live his message, with a steady heart, a gentle gaze, and a whole soul. The Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic, therefore, did not end. It simply changed form. Today it walks in the streets, in hospitals, in quiet homes, in caring hands, in comforting words. And perhaps, unknowingly, you have already been touched by one of its members. Someone who looked at you with compassion without judging you. Someone who truly listened to you. Someone who loved you without wanting anything in return. And perhaps now, after hearing all of this, you realize that it's not just about an old story. It's about you, about the decision you carry within to continue living divided, or allow yourself to come together, to be reborn, to resurrect, to sow, to clothe yourself in the light that you already are. So the final question is not what was the brotherhood, component placement, but rather, are you willing to be a part of it here and now? Because Christ still walks, the tunic still lives, and brotherhood is waiting for you to awaken. And now, mind unfettered, after all that you have seen, felt, and reflected upon so far, I invite you to an inner pause. What within you still needs to be stitched together? What has the world tried to tear apart, but you know, deep down, that you can still restore? Share in the comments what this story has stirred in your heart. Have you ever experienced something that made you realize there is an inner kingdom? Speak from the soul. Read the other comments. You are not alone. Spiritual manifestation strengthens when it is acknowledged collectively. The Brotherhood of the Torn Tunic is not a tale lost in the dust of history. It pulses now, in every person who chooses to live with truth. And if this story touched you, the next step of your journey is already before your eyes. Click now on the following video that appears on your screen. The Brotherhood of Light, the secret knowledge of Jesus that history erased. There we will explore hidden knowledge that was erased from the records, but not from the souls of those who still hear the call. Get ready to discover what Jesus taught, but history silenced. See you there, brother of light.